How I Overcame My Gravity by Fitz-James O'Brien. Originally published in the May 1864 issue of Harper's New Monthly Magazine and republished in the June 1958 issue of Satellite Science Fiction Magazine. Then in 4 collections of the author's stories and poetry: Dream Stories and Fantasies in 1988, The Wondersmith and Others in 2008, Gothic Short Stories in 2017, and What Was It? And Others in 2025. Stay tuned after the story for an essay on the author and his work by Sam Moskowitz, which can be found in Satellite Magazine, where it precedes the story. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. How I Overcame My Gravity. I have all my life been dallying with science. I have coquetted with electricity and had a serious flirtation with pneumatics. I have never discovered anything. Nevertheless, I am continually experimenting. My chambers are like the Hall of Physics in a university. Air pumps, pendulums, prisms, galvanic batteries, horseshoe magnets with big weights continually suspended to them. In short, all the paraphernalia of a modern man of science are strewn here and there, or stowed away on the shelves, much to the disgust of the maidservant, who on cleaning day longs to enter the sanctuary, yet dare not trust her broom amidst such brittle furniture. To survey my rooms, you would infallibly set me down as a cross between Faraday and Professor Morse. I dabble in all branches of natural philosophy. I'm continually decomposing water with electricity and combining gases until they emit the most horrible odors. I have had 4 serious explosions in my laboratory and have received various warnings from the fire marshal. The last was occasioned by the obstinacy of an Irish maidservant who, happening to behold a large mass of phosphorus in the dark, would insist on putting it out with a pail of water. The consequence was, of course, a conflagration that was near destroying the entire establishment. My friends visit me with fear and trembling. They're never certain that the bell pull may not be the pull of an electromagnetic battery, and when they seat themselves in a chair, seem to expect some unwanted phenomenon to exhibit itself. You will at once perceive, therefore, that I am an enthusiast. People, when they pass me in the street, point me out to their friends and whisper, "Very clever man, but so eccentric." I have gotten an immense reputation for ability, yet I don't believe that my best friend would trust me with the management of the most trivial business matter. I will confess that I am continually suffering losses on my own little property, and it would seem my fate to form relations with all the bankrupts and swindlers in the United States. These drains on my estate I always hoped to make good by an invention. I'm a very worldly fellow at bottom, let me tell you. Notwithstanding all my scientific pranks, I keep an eye out for the main chance, and I always held the hope that even when my affairs were going most to ruin, I would eventually light upon some lucky discovery which would make everything right again. There's Professor Morse. He lit upon an invention, and see what's the result? Why, he's asked over to Moscow by the Emperor of Russia to be present at his coronation, and is given a palace to live in, with a whole Ukraine of horses and Cossacks at his disposal. For a long time I had turned my attention to solving the problem of aerial locomotion. I fancy even now that I hit the white when I enunciated my grand principle of progression by means of atmospheric inclined planes, and at the time I made a model of a machine which illustrated my theory very fairly. But I had not capital enough for experiments on a large scale, and so great was the prejudice against all kinds of ballooning among moneyed men that I could not find the means to exploit what is incontestably a great physical truth. One day, as I was walking down Mercer Street in the neighborhood of Bleecker, I came opposite to the establishment of Chilton, the chemist, which stood on the corner. revolving 1,000 formless projects in my brain. My eyes, wandering like my mind, happened to light on the open door of the chemist's store. There, on a table placed a little way inside the entrance, I beheld a number of brass instruments lying, the shape and construction of which I was unfamiliar with. Idly and half mechanically I crossed over and entered the store for the purpose of examining them. The young man in attendance advanced to meet me, for I am known as a sort of amateur savant, and asked how he could serve me. "What is this?" I asked, taking one of the instruments that had attracted my attention from the table. "It seems to me to be some novelty." "It is truly a novelty," said my friend, the budding chemist. "It is a trifle, an ingenious trifle, certainly, discovered by a Connecticut genius, and its operations have as yet been entirely unaccounted for." "Ah!" I cried, becoming suddenly interested. "Let us look." The machine which I held in my hand may be thus briefly described. Imagine a brass globe, some 3 inches in diameter, having its axis playing in a narrow but tolerably thick rim of brass, just as a terrestrial globe revolves in its horizon, the only difference being that the globe was not central in the rim, or horizon, one of its poles being nearer to the end of its axis than the other. This peculiarity, I afterward discovered, was not essential to its working, being merely a matter of convenience. The remainder of the apparatus consisted of an upright steel rod fixed in a heavy wooden platform, candlestick fashion, and pointed like an electrical conductor. "How does it work?" I asked, after examining it attentively. "And what principles does it illustrate?" "It overthrows an established principle," answered my young friend, "and I am not clear as to what one it gives in place of it." "Let us see it." "Willingly." So saying, the young man took the globe, which revolved with little friction in its brass horizon, and winding a string round that portion of the axis which occupied the greatest space between the globe and ring, held the latter against his breast, and pulling the string violently, as boys pull the string of a humming-top, caused the globe to revolve with marvelous swiftness on its axis. The globe being thus in a rapid state of revolution in its horizon, he now showed me on the under surface of the last, and in a right line with the poles of the axis, a small cavity drilled, which admitted of the machine being placed on the upright pointed steel rod without any chance of slipping. This cavity was not a hole, only an indentation in which the point of the upright rod fitted, just as the axle of a watch wheel is received into the jewel. When this pivot, so to speak, was placed by the young chemist on the steel-pointed rod, the globe and its horizon, to my utter astonishment, proceeded to revolve in a plane at right angles to the revolution of the globe. There was a weight of some 6 pounds supporting itself in the air, and revolving with a regular motion. If my reader will take a long wedge of iron, heavier at one end than the other, and place the light end on the point of a rod stuck into the earth, and at right angles with it, and then conceive that wedge of iron revolving around the point where it touches the upright rod, he will have a pretty clear idea of the marvel which I witnessed at Mr. Chilton's. The attraction of gravitation then was overcome. In the same position in which I saw it maintaining itself, if the revolution of the brass globe was checked, the whole apparatus would instantly tumble to the earth. Why, then, did the simple centrifugal force of the globe enable it to thus marvelously poise itself in air? I was bewildered, and though my brain, from habit of dealing with problems, instantly groped for a reason, it could find none satisfactory. "Has no explanation been offered of this wonder?" I asked the chemist. "None, sir," was the reply. "At least none that were in the least logical or conclusive. Several people have sent us elaborate explanations, but when all have been divested of their scientific phraseology, they amount but to one arbitrary assertion of the fact that it revolves contradictorily to the laws of gravitation." I bought one of the toys and went home. I was lost in wonder. What became of Newton's famous apple now? It was rotten to its core. Had the wind or some other subtle power impressed upon it such a force as to cause it to revolve with immense rapidity, it would never have fallen, and Newton would never have discovered the so-called principle of the attraction of gravitation. The more I pondered, the more the marvel grew upon me. I spun the toy for hours, and was never weary of beholding it move in its appointed circle, self-sustaining and mysterious. After all, I considered it as only wonderful to me because I have been so long in the habit of accepting the theory of gravitation as an established fact. This new force, whatever it is that supports this toy in air, is not a whit more mysterious than the assumed force which is said to draw all things toward the center of the terrestrial globe. Ask what it is, and people tell you, the attraction of gravitation. Ask them what the attraction of gravitation is, and they will tell you, the force which draws matter to the center of the earth. And so the game of science runs. Arbitrary names are forced on you as facts. From battledore to shuttlecock is sent flying. The result becomes the definition and the explanation. It was in one of those moods of mind in which a man sometimes finds himself, groping for day through a horrible and oppressive darkness, yet certain that the chink through which it will flow lies somewhere within reach, that I suddenly lit upon the conviction that in this new discovery I held the secret of aerial locomotion. I argued in this way. If a violent rotary motion is sufficient to overcome the gravitating tendency of brass, it surely is that of human flesh. Neither is it at all necessary that the body of the person wishing to soar aloft should itself revolve. That would be fatal to life. But here, in this toy, I see the revolution of a brass globe supporting a heavy brass horizon, and if I were to put another weight, say a cent, on that brass horizon, it would still be supported. Therefore, if a machine on the same principle and proportionately large be constructed, it will support a man as this supports a cent. I had lit upon the truth that a body revolving on its own axis with sufficient velocity becomes self-supporting, and can be, impressed with a force that shall impel it in any given direction. With all the fever of a man of science and an enthusiast, I set to work. My machine cost me long nights of labor and brain work. I will endeavor to describe it. It was a copper globe of vast dimensions, hollow inside and traversed by a huge axis which buried its poles into an enormous horizon of iron. In the interior of this globe, parallel with the axis and a little above it, ran a false axis, also of iron, but playing loosely in holes bored in the globe itself, so that when the globe revolved this axis did not turn. On this bar of iron was placed a seat, which was intended for my own accommodation. This arrangement, it will be perceived, ensured to any person placed on the seat an equilibrium, no matter how quickly the globe by which he was surrounded revolved. It was, in fact, the same principle on which ship's lamps are suspended. There the lamp always remains horizontal, no matter how heavily the vessel rolls. The machinery by which the globe was caused to revolve on its axis is much too complicated to admit of any description unaccompanied with diagrams. Suffice it to say that it was so powerful as to ensure a revolution of this enormous copper sphere at the rate of 60 times in a second. A vast iron pillar, answering to the upright steel rod of the toy, I had also constructed. This was destined to receive and sustain the brass horizon. A machine constructed after the manner of the ancient catapult was also arranged for the purpose of launching the globe into air so soon as it had attained the necessary revolutionary velocity. The power of this catapult was cunningly graduated to certain distances. Assuming that the globe, while revolving, possessed no weight, it would, with a slight push, travel forever through space, unless the resistance of the atmosphere lessened and conquered its motion. But the globe would only revolve for a certain time, and in proportion as the velocity of revolution decreased, so would its tendencies to the earth return. Thus, knowing precisely how long this velocity would last, and in what ratio it would decrease, I was enabled to calculate to a pound what force to impress upon it by the aid of the catapult in order to send it any given distance. Everything being complete, and having invited a few friends to witness the experiment, I took my seat on the false axis with a beating heart, and gave the signal by which the attendants were to set the globe in motion. In an instant, the copper sphere was whirling around me with a velocity that I could not measure, but could only guess at from the humming noise that, to me, in the interior, sounded like the thunder of 1,000 skies. The interior of the globe was lit by pieces of massive flint glass set firmly in a belt form round the center. These windows, from the rapidity of motion, blended together in a zone of light that flashed continually before my sight. My seat on the axis, poised in the midst of this terrible whirl, remained steady and unaltered. Suddenly, I felt a jerk. A singular sensation quivered through my frame, and, rather by instinct than sensation, I knew that the catapult had launched me into space. I had calculated my distance for St. Paul's, Minnesota, and had accordingly set the catapult to the scale of force necessary to cast the globe that distance, making the proper allowance for the decrease of velocity. Would I succeed? I confess at this moment I felt grave doubts. 1,000 things might happen. The theory was perfect, but how many perfect theories had failed in practice? My elevation might be improperly calculated, and the machine be dashed to pieces against some intervening mountain. A few seconds would, however, decide all, as I had calculated that the journey would not consume more than 4 minutes and a half. While occupied with these considerations, I chanced to glance at the belt of light formed by the quickly revolving windows. It seemed to me to have changed its shape strangely. Instead of its previous regularity of form, it had become, as it were, ragged and uneven. On looking closer and examining it as narrowly as I could examine anything passing in such rapid revolution, I fancied that I saw it widen gradually before my eyes, and as if to confirm my suspicions, a blast of cold air fell on my cheek, and immediately after a hollow roaring filled the globe. The horrid truth burst upon me. I had forgotten to make the solidity of the copper globe more than equal to the centrifugal force, and the machine was bursting to pieces when I was at my highest elevation. My brain seemed to whirl with the globe on making this discovery, and with staring eyes I glared at the awful rent that was so rapidly increasing. A hurly-burly like that of the infernal regions filled my ears. It was the air rushing into the globe. Then came a crash and a horrible splitting sound. Instinctively, I grasped the immovable axis on which I was seated. Another crash, and I saw dimly the huge mass of copper surrounding me fly into 1,000 vast fragments, and I knew that I was falling. I gave one wild shriek and, "Mr. Wisp! Mr. Wisp! What are you doing? Let the tea urn alone, Mr. Wisp!" I looked up from the carpet on which I was lying and saw my wife, Mrs. William Wisp, extricating the silver tea urn, fortunately not filled, from my embraces. I was never able to explain to the good woman why I abstracted that article of plate from the side table during my dream, and for the first time in the history of science, an inventor was to be found congratulating himself that his invention had not succeeded completely. The Fabulous Fantast, an analysis of the work of an early American writer with prophetic gifts in the realm of science fantasy by Sam Moskowitz. Any serious student of American letters, asked to name the half-dozen writers of the 19th century who exerted the greatest influence upon the development of the American short story, would be most unlikely to omit Fitz-James O'Brien. In all honesty, he would have to admit that O'Brien's high standing as a practitioner of the short story was earned primarily on the basis of the science fiction he wrote, secondarily on his works of fantasy and horror, and on his other works, not at all. His most famous story, The Diamond Lens, became the literary sensation of the year when it appeared in the Atlantic Monthly for January 1858. The story deals with a young microbiologist who, in his thirst for knowledge, is frustrated by the limitations of his instrument. To find a way of constructing a superior one, he consults, through a medium, the spirit of Leeuwenhoek, known as the father of microscopy. Informed that he needs a diamond of 140 carats in order to construct a finer instrument, he obtains such a stone by killing a close friend who owns one. Through a special lens ground from the diamond, he views in a drop of water a microscopic world of surpassing beauty. In that tiny cosmos, his attention is drawn to a human-like female creature he names Animula. He falls hopelessly, despairingly in love with the small, unattainable woman whose grace and delicacy make the most accomplished women, dancers of the ballet, appear gross and clumsy by comparison. Though the drop of water containing the fantastic minute world was coated in oil of turpentine to ensure its protection, it gradually evaporates. Helpless to do anything about it, the young scientist watches his beloved Animula shrivel and die. Shattered by the experience, he loses the will to work and spends the rest of his life on public charity. Occasionally, he is invited to lecture at optical societies, where his theories are always regarded as good for a laugh. The tale carries the reader along with such verve, displays such a richness of imagination, and engenders so high an interest that it is little wonder that the editor of Atlantic felt that he could claim sole credit for publishing an original work of fiction which was destined to change the entire direction of American short story writing. This claim was not completely without substance, for though O'Brien did not write with the brilliant economy of means and accomplished style of Edgar Allan Poe, he did add an effective note of credibility to his stories by placing him in the familiar setting of the New York City of his day. The result was the beginning of a trend which the famous critic Arthur Hobson Quinn, in his book American Fiction, termed the transition to realism. That O'Brien was able to contribute to and profoundly influence a trend towards realism with stories of scientific extrapolation is impressive evidence of his originality and literary skill. Fitz-James O'Brien was not to be permitted to employ the plaudits of the critics for long. No sooner did The Diamond Lens achieve wide popular recognition than O'Brien was accused of having derived the theme of his story for an unpublished manuscript by William North entitled Microcosmos. Since North was dead and the manuscript in question was not found among his effects, the accusation could not readily be confirmed or disputed. As a result, O'Brien found himself trying to stamp out rumors that were springing up everywhere like prairie fires. Finally, Dr. Alfred H. Guernsey, editor of Harper's, came to O'Brien's defense by publicly stating that he had read North's manuscript, which had previously been submitted to him and rejected, and that there was not the remotest similarity in the handling of the microscopic world theme by the two authors. North's manuscript was never found, so the science fiction world lost a story of historical interest, if not of significant literary importance. The long-range influence of The Diamond Lens is nowhere better displayed than in the great number of similar stories which were submitted to editors after Ray Cummings' The Girl in the Golden Atom appeared in All Story magazine for March 15, 1919. What of Fitz-James O'Brien himself, his origin, background, and life? O'Brien was born in Ireland on December 31, 1828, the son of a well-to-do lawyer. Even as a youth, his stories and poems were published in Irish, Scottish, and British magazines. He squandered an inheritance of £8,000 in 2½ years. Following an unsuccessful attempt to run off with the wife of an English officer, he fled to the United States. He arrived in December 1852, and within a few short months succeeded in placing poems and stories in several American publications. His earliest reputation rested largely on his somewhat flowery poetry, and for some years his verse was lavishly praised by the critics of the period. When William Winter put together the first hardcover volume of his work, it was published by James R. Osgood and Company of Boston in 1881 under the title of The Poems and Stories of Fitz-James O'Brien. The poetry was placed ahead of the fiction and occupied nearly half of the book. The literary downgrading of his poetry came quickly, however, in the second edition of the book under the title The Diamond Lens and Other Stories. Published in 1885 by Charles Scribner's Sons, New York, all of the poems were omitted. In the United States, O'Brien lived the life of a true bohemian, almost as if he considered bohemianism inseparable from the literary accomplishments of a true man of letters. He never married or worried where his next dollar was coming from, and he played literary god to the aspiring writers of his circle. He was welcome in the better social as well as literary circles. His literary career in the United States lasted only 10 years. When the Civil War broke out, he enlisted in the Union Army and was wounded in one of the earliest skirmishes. His wound became infected, and he died shortly after an operation in which part of his left arm and shoulder were removed. The date of his death was April 6, 1862. O'Brien, then a lieutenant, was only 33 years old. While The Diamond Lens derived much of its form from Poe and Hawthorne, The Wondersmith, another highly admired short story, which first appeared in the Atlantic Monthly for October 1859, was patterned after the style of E.T.A. Hoffmann. The tale is a superbly atmospheric blend of science and fantasy, so individualistic that it remains unique of its type in American literature. The use of wooden mannequins, which can perform many of the actions of a human being, make this tale historically important as one of the earliest robot stories. What no one has ever mentioned is the debt A. Merritt's classic horror fantasy, Burn, Witch, Burn, owes to this story. Not only the basic plot, but the other devices, the fiendish, soulless devil dolls, the evil mover behind the scenes, the tiny needle-like weapons dipped in poison employed by the dolls, the malevolent eyes of the mannequins, are all so similar to those in The Wondersmith as to make coincidence unlikely. In The Wondersmith, there is a truly memorable scene in the battle between the Lilliputian assassins and two caged, talking minnow birds, during a battle in which the minnow birds have inflicted heavy casualties on their murderous adversaries. They are outflanked. Quote, "Quick as lightning, the minnow turned to repel this assault, but all too late. Two slender, quivering threads of steel crossed in his poor body, and he staggered into a corner of the cage. His white eyes closed, then opened. A shiver passed over his body, beginning at his shoulder tips and dying off in the extreme tips of the wings. He gasped as if for air, and then, with a convulsive shudder which ruffled all his feathers, croaked out feebly his little speech, 'What'll you take?' Instantly from the opposite corner came the gurgle, as it were, of brandy and water. Then all was silent. The minnow birds were dead." End quote. Earlier the same year, the March issue of Harper's new monthly magazine had carried O'Brien's story, What Was It? A Mystery, which is a well-conceived, almost documentary account of a man who is attacked by an invisible creature and who, after a terrific battle, subdues it. A plaster cast is made of the mysterious thing, which reveals a human-like form with a hideous face. The creature refuses to eat any food set before it and starves to death, carrying its mystery to the grave with it. Chronologically, this story precedes Guy de Maupassant's The Horia and Ambrose Bierce's The Damned Thing, both with very similar plots. There is strong internal evidence that Bierce drew heavily upon the idea and techniques of presentation of What Was It in composing his own story. It is extremely doubtful that de Maupassant was actually influenced by O'Brien, since there is no bibliographical record of O'Brien's story being translated into French. It is more likely that the invisible creature in The Horla was de Maupassant's symbolization of the mental twilight that he knew was encroaching and eventually did engulf him completely. Probably the least known of all of O'Brien's science fiction stories is How I Overcame My Gravity. This story may have been the last piece of fiction by that author to appear in print. It was published anonymously more than 2 years after his death in the May 1864 issue of Harper's New Monthly Magazine, and was never reprinted until Satellite Science Fiction resurrected it to accompany this article for its June 1958 number. While marred by the use of a dream ending, which is now virtually taboo in science fiction writing, the story is nevertheless skillfully written. It has a distinct historical importance for suggesting the gyroscopic principle as a possible anti-gravity method and for advancing the theory that a weightless object hurled hard enough by a catapult might travel away from the Earth forever. Had O'Brien dared just a little more in the direction of this line of reasoning, he might have preceded Edward Everett Hale by a few years as the first human being to suggest in either fact or fiction the concept of an artificial Earth satellite. As it was, O'Brien might very well have sparked Hale's thinking along such lines, since both were contributors to the same periodicals during the same period, and it is more than likely that Hale read most of O'Brien's output. Another Hale, Edward Everett Hale's sister, Lucretia Peabody, has involved the name of Fitz-James O'Brien in a literary mystery that still has not been solved to everyone's complete satisfaction. A set of books published in 1884 titled Stories by American Authors carries as the lead story in Volume 3 a tale entitled The Spider's Eye. This story, originally published anonymously, as were most stories of that period, first appeared in Putnam's Monthly Magazine for July 1856 and dealt with the possibility of reading people's thoughts through acoustics. The entire plan and development of the story and even some of the phrases seem typically O'Brien's, and a pattern can be shown in the plotting similar to that of The Diamond Lens, which appeared 2 years later. When the story was included in Stories by American Authors, O'Brien was given credit for authorship both on the front binding cloth and inside of the book. However, a second edition of the set, published in 1898, attributes the story to Lucretia P. Hale, who made her reputation writing charming juveniles such as the Peterkin Papers and books on crocheting like Faggots for the Fireside. Were it not for the fact that Lucretia P. Hale has written at least one other fantasy, which appears to be incontestably her own, the story in question could probably be listed without challenge as one of O'Brien's. It is a story whose imagination and execution would bring him no discredit. The facts of the matter are that Lucretia P. Hale has had published under her own name in both Atlantic Tales and in a separate book, Queen of the Red Chessboard, a fantasy bearing the last-mentioned title, in its original anonymous publication in the February 1858 issue of Atlantic Monthly, only a month after the appearance of O'Brien's smash success, The Diamond Lens. In that same magazine, Queen of the Red Chessboard, judged by its adroit writing and perfect short story form, could easily have been mistaken for a work of the transplanted Irish author. The story is a slickly written fantasy of a chess queen who turns into a real woman and is followed into the real world by the White Prince, who has held her prisoner on the chessboard. Given the choice of marrying a real human and remaining free, she chooses to return to the chessboard as a prisoner of her White Prince. Internal evidence in the story would have made its classification as one of O'Brien's very likely, since there is one passage which remarkably expresses the basic idea of The Diamond Lens, as follows. Quote, Is all this beauty around you created merely for you and the other insects about us? I have no doubt it is filled with invisible life." End quote. This fantasy demonstrates that Lucretia Hale was perfectly capable of writing a short story of the caliber of The Spider's Eye. It seems probable that when that story was collected for the book, it was understandably mistaken for one of O'Brien's works. The error was undoubtedly spotted by Miss Hale, who probably saw to it that a correction was made in the second edition. Perhaps this controversy may have a salutary effect and result in unearthing other stories of a similar nature by Miss Hale, so that she will at least be considered when appraisals of American fantasy writers are made. The Golden Ingot by Fitz-James O'Brien, 1858, may ring familiar to some since it was adapted to television only a few years back. It tells of an old scientist searching for a way to turn baser metals into gold, who believes he has succeeded when one morning he finds a gold ingot in his crucible. He dies of a stroke upon learning that his daughter, in order to make him happy, has saved her money and secretly purchased a gold ingot. While almost a bit too direct and bare and containing a note of the over-melodramatic, the story is nevertheless an effective one. Among the better-known fantasies of Fitz-James O'Brien is The Lost Room, 1858, which tells of a man who leaves his room on an errand, then returns to find it filled with strangers and the furniture changed. Unable to prove it is his room, he tosses dice for it and loses. He is ejected. When he tried to regain entrance, there is only a blank wall, and he never again finds his room. This story has inspired the writing of dozens of others on similar themes. Despite some not-too-convincing dialogue on the part of the lead character, the overall effect is powerful and memorable. One of the most charming and delightful fantasies woven by O'Brien is The Dragon Fang Possessed by the Conjurer Paiu Lu, 1856. In modern times, only Frank Owen has come as close to capturing the complete essence and mood of Chinese storytelling. This tale of a Chinese conjurer is strikingly successful and truly outstanding. If there was any factor that characterized O'Brien's talent, it was his professional versatility. This is aptly displayed by his mastery of the standard ghost story gambit in The Pot of Tulips, 1855. In that story, the ghost of a man who had evidence of his wealth, so that a child he thought was not his own would fail to inherit his property, returns from the grave to remedy his error by pointing out the hiding place of his legacy. It is a good story of its kind, strongly reminiscent of another great Irish fantasist, Sheridan Le Fanu. A beautifully wrought, weird prose pastel by O'Brien, The Child Who Loved a Grave, has never been reprinted since its original anonymous publication in Harper's New Monthly Magazine for April 1861. It tells of the unhappy boy of drunken and bickering parents who forms an attachment for the quiet grave of a child. He gains solace by spending time there. When it develops that the grave belongs to a member of nobility, it is dug up and the remains removed overseas. Deprived of his only source of comfort, the boy, before going to bed that night, tells his father that he is going to die and begs that he be buried in the newly opened grave. The next morning, the father finds him dead. It is quite possible that O'Brien may have written one of the earliest surrealistic fantasies in From Hand to Mouth, which was originally serialized in the New York Picayune during 1858. Disembodied eyes, ears, hands, and mouths fill a hotel room in this story, which, though skillfully composed, loses the reader with situations so complex that no one can figure them out, not even the author, who never finished the last installment. The publisher of the weekly, Frank H. Ballou, finally completed the story himself. Despite this, From Hand to Mouth was twice reprinted in book form, once in 1868 in Good Stories, and again in Famous Stories, believed to have been issued in 1879. In any form, it remains a collector's item. Other stories by Fitz-James O'Brien worth mentioning for their elements of the supernatural or horror are The Bohemian, 1885, which employs hypnotism to induce extrasensory perception. Though the devices of the story are dated, a number of passages are sheer poetry. Jubal the Ringer, 1858, concerns a bell ringer who employs a flock of bats to loosen the plaster binding the stones of his belfry, then utilizes the acoustical vibrations of his bell to bring the stones crashing down into the church, killing himself and the woman he loves, who is marrying another, together with the marriage procession. A Terrible Night, 1856, is a suspense story where a man kills his best friend as a result of a fear-induced nightmare. The wife, in Mother of Pearl, 1860, kills her child and attempts to kill her husband while under the influence of dope. O'Brien's failing from the long-term literary view was that he was too talented, too versatile, and too conscious of what the market of his period preferred. O'Brien was a true professional. Whether in story, essay, poem, song, play, or critique, he could usually strike the mood of the times and give the editors and the public just what they wanted. Making a sale was not his problem. The result was that if O'Brien depended upon his general fiction and verse for his standing among American authors, anything more elaborate than a footnote in a general history of literature would have been an act of courtesy. Only when he turned to science fiction or fantasy did he begin to display the full force of his truly outstanding talents. At such times, his interest in the subject matter compelled him to write with his mind on the story instead of the editor or the public. Though his output of such work was small, the average quality is truly remarkable, and its far-reaching influence is still visible in the field of science fiction and fantasy today. A comprehensive picture of the life and writings of Fitz-James O'Brien, including his poetry and non-fantasy, can be obtained by reading Francis Wall's biography and bibliography titled Fitz-James O'Brien, a work of top-rank scholarship. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.